Hi there, students. Buff. Buff can be a verb, an adjective, or a noun. We even have a phrasal verb, to buff up. Okay, this word buff has a variety of meanings, and I'm going to look at the main meanings to start with. Firstly, as a verb, to buff means to polish. He cleaned his shoes and then buffed them with a soft cloth. He buffed the wooden surface until it shone. So, to polish. And you can also use buff in role-playing games, RPGs. You can buff characters, you can increase their abilities by using a magic spell. So, to buff, to polish, to make shine. And then we have the phrasal verb to buff up, to improve. So my English is a bit rusty. I need to buff up my English. I need to polish it, make it shine again. So to buff up, to go over again, to make it good, to take out the mistakes and the things that are not so good in something. Okay? Now, the second meaning, buff as an adjective, is a colour. You know these brown envelopes that you can get? Well, these are what I call a buff coloured envelope. You see this colour here? I think these two colours here. This is buff. It's like a yellow, orange, brown colour. Yeah? So, a colour, buff. If you look in internet, it'll show you the exact definition of buff. I think the reason for this colour is that buff was, well, it still is, it's a type of rough leather, or a type of leather originally made from buffalo skin, buffalo hide, and that's where the brown yellow colour or the idea comes from. But buff as a leather, that's not very common nowadays. Okay, thirdly, they use buff as an adjective in the US to mean muscular, very muscular. He's a buff bodybuilder. He became buff by working out with weights every day for months and months. And you can also use buff to mean physically attractive, but in this muscular way. The girls all think he is terribly buff. So notice this, I think, is American, and it's a bit informal as well. Okay, a buff is a person, is an enthusiast, a well-informed student of some subject, a fan of it. He's a train buff. He knows all about trains. He's a buff of the Second World War. He's a fan. He studies the subject a lot and knows all about it. You might call me an English buff. You could have a cheese buff, a cookery buff. Yeah? Somebody who, they specialise in this. They know a lot about it. And then we have a phrase in English, in the buff, which means naked. So buff without clothes, in the buff, in your birthday suit. We went swimming in the buff. I walked into the room and there was my mother standing in the buff. Now there's at least one other meaning of buff, but it's pretty old-fashioned and not used, meaning to hit. He buffed me, he hit me. It's related to this word buffet, or the game Blind Man's Buff. But this, using to buff as to hit, very unusual. So So let's look at these again. To buff, to polish. I need to buff up my skills. I need to buff up my writing skills. Buff, a yellow-brown colour. Yeah, a buff-coloured envelope. Buff, a type of leather. A buff jacket, a buff leather jacket. Then buff, muscular or attractive. A buff boxer. Okay, a buff, a knowledgeable enthusiast. He's a phrasal verb, buff. And then in the buff, naked. So, we are all born in the buff. That's quite a selection of meanings for you. Now, let's look at formality. This meaning to buff, to polish, I'd give a 5 in formality. Flexible. Regular verb, he buffed the piece of wood. He has buffed it for several hours. And then to buff up as a phrasal verb, I'd probably give 4.5 in formality. To improve, to rejuvenate, if you like. The colour buff, I'd probably give this maybe a 6 in formality. It's a little bit technical, but it's certainly you could use it almost anywhere. And buff meaning leather, I would say a 6 in formality, but it's not very common. Then this meaning muscular or muscularly attractive. This is informal, 3.5 in formality. So not something you would use in a formal document. An enthusiast, a weather buff. I would probably give this a 4 in formality. I think enthusiast would sound better in something more formal. And then finally this phrase, in the buff, I'd probably give it a 3.5 to 4 in formality. Naked, yeah? Completely naked. So, what about the origin? Well, the origin is easy. It comes into English from French, buffle, which is a buffalo. And that itself comes from late Latin, buffalus, meaning a buffalo. So buff is related to the colour of buffalo skin or buffalo leather. So to buff, to polish, a brown colour, to muscular or muscularly attractive, a buff, an enthusiast, in the buff, naked. And those are the meanings you need to remember. So enough. If you enjoyed the video, give it a rating, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now. Buff.